Hi, welcome to Wings for Life. My name is Ann Edenfield Sweet. I'm the executive director and founder of Wings, and we are so happy that you're with us tonight. Although tonight we are talking about a very serious topic, suicide, which is a national crisis. We have an expert with us tonight. I'm so thrilled that he is here. Robert Lewis is a behavioral health specialist. He's been doing this for over 30 years. He has worked with people of all ages. He specializes in couples therapy, effective communication skills and relationship enhancement. He does addiction work, treats mood disorders, anxiety, depression, and he's also worked in district court as a clinician and a mediator with family court for many, many years. He is a very, very caring, loving, and very educated man that is going to help us with this. So tonight, I'd like to welcome Robert Lewis. Here you go.
Thank you, Ann, for that very generous introduction. A couple of other things I'll add to my background. I also am a bereavement support group facilitator for the Children's Grief Center of New Mexico. I've been doing that for about 11 years, and more recently, the last 5, working with a men's group, doing the fathers. And that's been a very rewarding and gratifying experience. I'm going to start with my friend was going to be here to do a portion of this presentation, but she had to back out at the last minute. So she gave me permission to share some or all of what she wanted to talk about. So I'm going to include that in my piece. So we'll go about a half an hour, and it should give you plenty of time for the breakout. So I'm going to kind of read this as if she was presenting it to you. And I'll, read part of it. So, I am a retired teacher on the board for Breaking the Silence New Mexico and Survivors of Suicide, and I'm a support group facilitator for a mom survivors group. So this is Desiree's story. My son Ryan took his life on May 1st, 2006. He was 24 years old, 1 month away from his 25th birthday. I was devastated and shocked, and being alive was almost unendurable. The heavy weight of my felt responsibility made it so hard to breathe, and guilt is the most prevalent and nagging emotion after suicide. And survivors blame ourselves for not doing more for our loved one or for doing too much. Suicide can shatter the things you take for granted about yourself, your relationships, and your world. Desperately trying to understand, I wrote dozens of journals that eventually became a book called I Still Believe. I could let my guilt flow onto the page to painfully examine the harsh realities of not having acknowledged the mental illness from my son, for which I had no prior education. In my book, I include some of Ryan's writings from journals he had kept for many, many months, struggling in silence and shame as he tried to understand what was happening to him. I was once a living, breathing, creating human being with an identity and dignity who only wanted to live normally again. So Ryan's illness and death tried my faith to the core. I wasn't sure I believed anymore. And when suicide happens, even in faith communities, but it baffles us because we may assume that somehow being people of faith, we're exempt. But the death by suicide of a child, a parent, or a friend leaves many unanswered questions. My dark night of the soul is cemented into my heart. Death itself has seemed to give me an understanding and acceptance of the potentially tragic nature of life. What is suicide? Well, it's taking of one's own life by one's own hand. Many were planned, some left notes. For many families, it seemed to come out of nowhere. Mental illness and suicide are very often seen as perhaps selfish, cowardly, or regarded as moral failures or weaknesses by society. I've come to learn that they are none of these things. In our SOS groups, we say it's not your fault, it is not my fault, it's not their fault. There is no blame in suicide, regardless of how many times one thinks that there is. There are many warning signs that can signal that somebody is struggling and might be at risk, and I'll go over some of those warning signs in my talk. But also we need to remember that there may not be any signs at all. People can hide their struggles out of shame, embarrassment. So effective suicide assessment really requires that we ask, are you thinking of killing yourself? And of course, there's a big stigma associated with mental illness. Those familiar with the stigma of mental illness know the pain of it, and it's the same for suicide. And stigma is the number one reason why people don't seek help. 90% of people who die by suicide suffered from a diagnosable mental illness, and most received either no treatment or inadequate treatment. So without treatment, mental illness can worsen, it can become chronic, or it can end in suicide. These are a few statistics. Every 11 minutes, somebody in America takes his or her own life. This is from save.org, 2021. And then it has been researched that that leaves 20 people left behind. It's the first leading cause of death in New Mexico among youth ages 10 to 24. And worldwide, more people die by suicide than by homicide or warfare. 23 of our veterans in this country die every day by their own hand. So what are the causes of suicide? Well, as she had mentioned, mental illness plays a large part in suicidal feelings. They may have a biological basis or a chemical imbalance, and there's a breakdown in that chemical processing. And people of logic and science, we continue to search for anything that can stem the public health crisis of suicide, and it is a public health crisis. And we need to keep searching because suicide is complex. The brain is complex, and it cannot be narrowed down to one thing. There's no single cause for a person taking suicide, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my talk. So in addition to a mental illness like depression, anxiety, suicide usually includes an environmental or a social trigger, like bullying, loss of a job, a breakup, or any number of different stressors. These are usually what we attribute to the cause of the suicide, but they are just the last drop of water on an already too full cup. So she goes on to say that Ryan's death changed the trajectory of her life. She started a mission to educate youth, parents, teachers in mid-high schools with a presentation on mental illness and suicide awareness. She began a nonprofit organization called Breaking the Silence New Mexico, BTS. And at their presentation, they give people the language and children the language to talk about these topics. So illnesses like depression or anxiety can be recognized early and treated. In their presentations, they don't talk about the methods of suicide, but they remove the taboo by talking about feelings and the pressures and stresses of contemporary life, particularly for our youth. So, instead, you need to acknowledge a person's pain as being real. You have to know the resources that are available in your community to support someone. You acknowledge a person's pain is real. There may not be a solution that soon, but that you will be there by their side to help them find a life that's worth living. I'll talk a little more about that when I do my talk. So talking about suicide does not give somebody the idea to do it. Instead, not sweeping it under the rug may actually save a life. One thing that Ann did mention that was part of my training, and I've been a mental health provider for over 30 years. Trained initially in California, and I moved to Santa Fe and then down to Albuquerque. In the 1990s, and I was a therapist at Santa Fe High School during those years, and I was trained by the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, very much in the news these last 2 years. It was up in Canada, and it was in suicide prevention and intervention. And the way they started off that week was a whole week. And we had some indigenous people up from the north, down from the north. It was fascinating, very profound training. They asked us to close our eyes and visualize a river that is running through our community. So those of you out there, I'd like to just close your eyes for a minute and visualize kind of a meandering river that's running through your community. And people with suicidal thoughts, they get into this river. Now, some at the headwaters, some in the middle, others close to the waterfall. But without an intervention to pull them out, they are most likely going to go over the falls to their deaths. But not everybody in the river have a clear and decisive intent of dying. In fact, many are ambivalent about it. They're of two minds. There was a research study done, I think it was in the late 60s or early 70s, a group of researchers. They interviewed people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, and they lived. And a good percentage of those people said that after they jumped and about halfway down, they regretted their decision. We are not a very transparent culture. By that I mean, so many of us, because of the stigma of mental illness, we're all kind of zippered up. We don't talk about what really bothers us. We all have issues. In 2018, there were 48,000 suicides. 90% of those who killed themselves suffered from major depressive disorder. I'll go over some of the characteristics in a moment. Life events, trauma, they're two major contributors to major depression. It's a stress-related disease, losses, separation, humiliation. They're contributing factors. And of course, the pandemic. The pandemic has put our kids at risk for dropping out of school. They've lost their motivation. Some of them, they have been isolated from their peer groups, their friends, teachers. They may have lost a parent or a sibling to the virus. So what I wanted to focus on for the remainder of my talk, in addition to some other statistics, is I've always been intrigued by this question, even as a mental health professional. What motivates somebody to really want to end their life? What do they get to? What gives them that impetus to make that decision? But like Desiree said, and most things, it's complicated. There's no one single thing that's going to make somebody decide to suicide. So we may never know what's going on in somebody's mind at those moments, but we can surely say what may have contributed to it. One of my clients described his suicidal ruminations this way at a time he thought of ending his life. He said, I felt at that time that it didn't matter to anybody. I felt like a burden, and I don't hold any meaning for anybody. Now through therapy and positive self-talk and those, darker moments, he'd say, I am so much better than my negative thoughts. I do not define myself by that. I want to mention a few names here, and one of them most surely you will recognize. The first is, which is the impetus for these talks, there was a panel that we presented at Wings after the death of my friend, Luis, in March 2019. We were in the leadership roles at our synagogue. He was a gay man. He was married. His husband died of cancer. I don't think he ever got over that. I think that was one of the contributing factors. But I had pulled away from the synagogue. I had not stayed in touch with him for 5 months, perhaps. And the next thing I know, I see an email blast saying that Luis, condolence message. And I said, what? I couldn't believe it. I thought, was he sick? He didn't tell anybody? And I said, oh my God, I hope he didn't take his life. Well, it turned out he did. The first attempt was by pills. When he was discharged from the hospital, he was embarrassed, ashamed. I knew nothing about this. And the next thing he did was he found a gun, and that ended his life. Nobody had a clue that what would have motivated this guy to take his life. He was presented so differently. So there was so many questions, no answers. Rich Simon was the editor of the Psychotherapy Networker. I've been getting the Psychotherapy Networker quarterly for years. He had therapist friends, from across the country. And he would have this symposium. He was the MC. He was charismatic. He was wonderful. Had a fabulous career. Well, he killed himself. And when I read that, I was shocked, taken aback by it. Only his close friends and his family knew that he suffered from bipolar disorder. So that was the contributing factor. Now, one other person I know you know, she was interviewed on Oprah Winfrey, Meghan Markle. She was the Duchess of Sussex. She married Harry in a royal, magical wedding. But once she was in the role of that palace infrastructure, she felt trapped. She felt she couldn't be herself. She couldn't complain about anything. She had to put on a smile. She had to wave. She had to just not be real. Well, it really started to get to her until one day she told Harry, and the press was printing vicious lies about her. So she said to her husband then at the time that she can't be trusted alone by herself. She was in that river. Of course, he did the right thing because the palace wouldn't give them treatment. They wouldn't permit it. It was a stigma. You don't do that in the royal family. You don't ask for help, particularly for a mental disorder. So they subsequently went to Canada, and then now they're living in California. They're expecting another child. Everything's fine. But all these people, the reason I'm mentioning this, they're all in the river. And I'm not just talking about having a bad day. I mean, we all have those. So let's look at the symptoms of major depression, this particular mood disorder. It could be mild, moderate, severe. So here's a list of symptoms of a more serious type of depression. So imagine this person is depressed most of the day, every day, feels sad, empty, hopeless. Diminished interest or pleasure in most or almost all of their activities, most of the day, nearly every day. Weight gain, weight loss, sleeping too much or not at all, staying in bed all day. A reduced ability to think or concentrate or even make decisions. Sometimes severe depression can include psychotic symptoms. Recurrent thoughts of death, not just the fear of dying. Suicidal thoughts without a plan or an attempt or a specific plan on how to kill yourself. So these kinds of symptoms usually occur with somebody who has ongoing depression. It's not a single episode. And there may be periods of resilience when these symptoms aren't as present, but it will return. Without intervention, treatment, they're going to come back. So I want you to just think about this for a minute, which is kind of the theme of what I was talking about. What it must be like to be experiencing these symptoms relentlessly, day after day. Eventually, a person can reach a point, that dark place, where they decide to go over that imaginary waterfall to end their life. They're mentally exhausted. They're demoralized. They feel hopeless. They don't want to be a burden any longer on a loved one or their family. But it is important to know if yourself are experiencing any of these kinds of symptoms of depression, you reach out for help. And there's plenty of help out here. But if you know someone who might be experiencing some of these symptoms, you have to ask them direct questions. And for me, as a mental health professional, if I'm assessing a new client with depression, I tell them, for people that are suffering this kind of depression, they can often think of self-harm. They can often think of hurting themselves. And I ask them, have you considered suicide? Do we need a safety plan? If a person admits to ruminations of it, I inquire what or who they think about that stops them from making a decision to end their life. And this is really important because you have to work with the person's ambivalent. Remember, most people don't really want to die. They just want to escape from what's feeling so bad. And when you get people talking about it, you'll learn about who they care about, what would be a deterrent from taking their lives. It could be a parent, a sibling, a best friend, boyfriend, girlfriend, grandmother. It could be a dog or a cat they love. I've heard them all. So for me, I give them permission without judgment to talk about that dark side. And they open up. But you have to give them permission to talk about it. But also slowly tease out the other side, the part of themselves that chooses life and why. Now, since our coronavirus arrived here, depression and anxiety in America have become rampant. Federal surveys show that 40% of Americans are now grappling with at least one mental health or drug-related problem. But young adults have been hit harder than any other age group, 75% struggling. Even more alarming when the CDC recently asked some young adults if they had thought about killing themselves in the past month. 1 in 4 said they had. Now here's a very vulnerable population I would be very remiss if I didn't include them in this talk. And that's our LGBTQ youth. They face unique challenges. There's a wonderful project out there called the Trevor Project, Trevor. I think it was named after somebody. But they did a national survey of nearly 35,000 LGBTQ youth, 13 to 24, across the whole country. The sample is diverse. LGBTQ youth of color, 38% being transgender or non-binary. Non-binary, is meanings that it's an umbrella term for gender identities that are neither male or female. And today, if you're aware of it, there's a lot of different pronouns that people of this population like to define themselves as. 70% of this population stated that their mental health was very poor most of the time or always during COVID. And almost half of them said they wanted therapy from a mental health professional, but they were unable to receive it in the past year. 75% of these youth reported that they experienced discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity at least once in their lifetime. And this was a really interesting stat for me. Transgender and non-binary youth reported having pronouns that are respected by all of the people that they live with, attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have their pronouns respected by anyone whom they lived with. Now think about that. They were accepted. They weren't judged. It cut the suicide rate in half. It's remarkable. And you'd think that the suicide rates after this pandemic were higher, but in fact they were significantly lower in 2020. Why? Because this is due to outreach. There had been a drastic increase in mental health services, hotlines, online support groups, telemedicine, telehealth sessions via video, phone sessions, crisis hotlines. I want to mention a program which is terrific. It's Mental Health First Aid. You can contact them at mentalhealthfirstaid.org. This program teaches how to identify, understand, and respond to signs of mental illness and substance use disorders. They also teach you how to assess for risk of suicide or harm, and listening non-judgmentally. It's a great program. They come to wherever you are for a whole day and walk you through this. On average, 123 people die by suicide every day. Another sobering statistic. This is by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. 1 in 5, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults live with a mental illness. Let's just go over a few myths and realities about suicide. People who talk about it won't do it. Well, the reality is 75% of people who have killed themselves have talked about it. Suicidal people are attention getters, they're manipulative. The reality is 75% have attempted several times. Anyone seriously contemplating suicide is going to do it. They're not going to talk about it. Well, that's not true. The reality is that most people who talk about it are ambivalent about taking their own lives. But when they talk about their ambivalence, they share it, then you are talking with them with the part of them who wants to live. There are just a few common warning signs for suicide. You'll have something that you can make reference to online, and Ann has put in there, but making suicidal statements, preoccupied with death in conversation, writing or drawing, giving away belongings, showing aggressive or hostile behavior, running away from home, risk-taking behavior. There are many of them. Sudden change in personality, out of character to the person, from being upbeat to being quiet, withdrawn, going from quiet to be very happy. And remember, most people who feel this kind of hopelessness and despair, they do not want to die, but they want to escape from feeling so bad. They feel trapped. And lastly, I want to go over the what-ifs or the if-only, which, the survivors of those people who have taken their life get into this kind of questioning. And maybe you can look at this in a little bit different way. As human beings, we get into the habit of trying to understand things that don't make any sense. Someone we know or don't know, we hear about, dies tragically in a car accident. So we immediately want to make sense of it, understand why, how it happened. And this habit is especially true when it comes to a suicide, and we can't make any sense of it. That certainly was for me with my friend Luis. I couldn't make sense of it. With the many fathers I've worked with at the Children's Grief Center who've lost a child to suicide, they agonize over it with these kinds of questions, the guilt, trying to understand why. What if I did this, if only I did that. Well, that's a rabbit hole you don't want to go down with what you could have done or why you didn't even suspect it. Even if it's your own child, it's like trying to understand the nature of the air we breathe before taking a breath. I mean, we know where that's going to lead. So I'm suggesting maybe a better and deeper wisdom, more of a spiritual take on it, is to embrace, with the things that don't make sense in this life, to accept that we don't know what we don't know, and embrace and lean into the experience of it, as difficult as that can be. And lastly, I've always been intrigued. I believe it's a biblical phrase, and the truth shall set you free. I mean, I interpret this to mean the truth is your authenticity. It means being real, taking ownership of your thoughts, your feelings, your actions, and then letting another person that you feel safe with in, and being open, honest, and vulnerable with them. Take off that mask you hide behind. That could be the difference between life and death. So there is a lot of help out here. Take advantage of it if it's for you, if it's someone else you know that opens up to you with these kinds of ruminations of self-harm. You have an obligation, as far as I'm concerned, to help them get the help they need. And then thank them for the courage it took to share that with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Robert. I just know that that's going to help a lot of people. And also, I'd like to remind you that if you go to our website at wingsfly.org, we've got a placemat that has all kinds of information on there. A lot of the suicide warning signs and what to do if you think somebody is suicidal. So please go and look at that. If you are contemplating something or you're worried about somebody, and please listen to what Robert and Desiree both said, that stop questioning yourself about what you wished you could have done. Find professional help to help you deal with this. And I am sorry if you have had to deal with this in your life. I always like to close with a story, so tonight we're going to close with a story. It's called The Frogs. A group of frogs were traveling through the woods, and two of them fell into a deep pit. All of the other frogs gathered around the pit. When they saw how deep the pit was, they told the unfortunate frogs they would never get out. The two frogs ignored the comments and tried to jump out of the pit. Well, the other frog kept telling them to stop, that they were as good as dead. Finally, one of the frogs took heed to what the other frogs were saying, and he simply gave up. He fell down and he died. But the other frog continued to jump as hard as he could. Once again, the crowd of frogs yelled at him to stop the pain and suffering and just die. But he jumped even harder and finally made it out. When he got out, the other frogs asked him, "Why did you continue jumping? Didn't you hear us?" The frog explained to them that he was deaf. He thought they were encouraging him the entire time. Well, this story holds two lessons. Number one, there's a power of life and death in the tongue. An encouraging word to someone who is down can lift them up and help them make it through the day. Robert mentioned a lot of that. Number two, a destructive word to someone who is down can be what it takes to kill them. Be careful what you say. Speak life to those who cross your path. So the power of words, it's sometimes hard to understand that an encouraging word can go such a long way. Anyone can speak words that tend to rob another of the spirit to continue in difficult times. Special is the individual who takes the time to encourage another. Therefore, encourage one another and build them up, just as in fact you are doing. And actually, that's what we're trying to do at Wings for Life. We're trying to give you wings to fly for the rest of your life. and we are going to try to educate you along the way. So thanks for joining us. Now, if you are part of our Facebook or YouTube audience, this is the end of the program. For those of you that are going to, that are with us on Zoom, stay tuned because we're going right into breakout rooms and you'll be able to talk to Robert and ask him some more questions. So thanks, everybody. We are so grateful that you could be with us tonight. Next week, we will not be here because it's Memorial Day, so I hope everybody is out having a wonderful time with your family. We look forward to seeing you back in June. Thanks, everybody. Good night.